Hello everyone, Dr. Eames here. This time I'd like to talk to you about the quantitative management approach, which is a fairly modern theory of management. This mainly happened during the 1940s and 50s. And really, when you say the word quantitative, it's about counting, it's about using numbers, and that's exactly what this perspective was. Um, in those days, we didn't have calculators yet, and mathematics, we were not doing graphing or any of the things that we do today with modern math. There was still widespread use of the slide rule. And so that was a very cumbersome way to do the math of the day and so forth. And really, this came about during the time of World War II. As we were at war, and the whole world was, there was an increasing need to be able to plan ahead, to find out how much of this was needed, where it needed to go, how long it would take to get there, how long it would take to build it, and all those sorts of things were going on. And so the quantitative perspective really became quite important, particularly in managing the companies of the day and so forth. And it was all about production and using these mathematical models and processes to really make decisions and so forth. Um, Quantitative management, the approach, really spawned a couple of disciplines. One is management science, which is really the idea that management can tackle many different sorts of problems using the right approach, and also operations management, which we certainly still have today as well. What we really saw happen was after the 1940s and 50s, these mathematical models were much relied upon and so forth, but they were very time consuming to work out. That began to change pretty quickly once we had the first calculators. We got the first calculators in the 60s once we had developed the first transistors, and transistors were small little power packs that today we can make to an infinitesimal size. But in the beginning, these were a little bulkier and bigger, and we got the first handheld calculators. This really propelled the quantitative management approach and made it much easier to rely on these models. And then certainly when we hit the 90s, the mid 90s and so forth, we were already using computers to do computations and advanced math and so forth. And we would use these sorts of numbers and this approach to guide us in most of our decision making and setting our goals and so forth and doing those sorts of things. But there are a few limitations, obviously, with just focusing on the numbers. So let me just briefly go over the contributions of quantitative management with you and also the limitations. First of all, the contributions. The first contribution is that sophisticated quantitative techniques can really assist managers in making informed decisions. And this makes sense. If you can count something and measure it and plan for it and so forth, it is a big help to you. The second contribution is the use of these mathematical models, whether they were strictly by slide rule and hand computation in the past, and then gradually moved up through calculators and then the use of the PC and so forth. It really raised awareness and understanding of how complex the processes and situations of business were tending to be. And that's why quantitative management approach was so popular during its time, and that it seemed to be the next greatest thing, the one way to do something, and that if we rely on the numbers, we can generally get it right. The third contribution was that it certainly was useful in controlling things and keeping you on track. And keeping on track is one of the four functions of management, the controlling feature. So it was very useful in the planning, but especially in gathering information, data, feedback, and so forth to let us know how are we doing. And so with the advent of these quantitative methods and so forth, we really did have a much better notion of how we were doing financially and production-wise and so forth. But certainly there are limitations to what you can do with numbers and the counting of numbers and the planning, because it doesn't really take into account that human element very well. So the first limitation of quantitative management is it cannot fully explain or even predict the behavior of people and organizations. Now, what statistics can do for us is tell us broad trends. If you have enough numbers to use, enough people to compute, and so forth, you can say, oh, here's a broad trend. But it doesn't predict individual behavior at all, or even of groups. So that is one real downside to making that your major influence of what you are as a manager. The second limitation is this mathematical sophistication comes at an expense usually to other managerial skills which you should be spending equal time on. In other words, it's very easy to get hung up in the numbers, that's all you focus on and that's what you think about, and then you really do neglect a lot of other processes, in particular the human side, if you just focus on the numbers. So it leads us to the third limitation of quantitative management, which means that sometimes this extreme focus on the quantitative methods really caused managers to make sort of unrealistic assumptions or unfounded assumptions. They started spending too much time on the what ifs and the worst case scenarios and the best case scenarios, and a lot of times those are nice to know what your parameters of operation are, but they don't really help you make the best decisions and so forth. And so the general applicability of quantitative methods really was limiting in some respects. So certainly just relying on the numbers could never be the one universal perspective that in the beginning of the management profession, so many scholars and theorists and managers really wanted to find that one best way, which today, as I've said before, we don't really believe in that. All right, folks, that's all for this time. I'll talk to you again soon.